There are scars that time cannot erase. Even after 5 decades, I can still smell the wet earth mixed with gunpowder and hear the screams of my comrades echoing in the darkness of the Vietnamese jungle. My name is Mark Tanner, former Green Beret of the 173rd Airborne Battalion, and this is my story of the battle that changed my perception of war and human nature forever. During training as a Green Beret, they taught us to be resilient, to endure pain and deprivation, but nothing could have prepared us for what we would face on Hill 875. Hell has many faces, and in those 4 days, I got to know every one of them. Our unit had been ordered to take and secure that strategic elevation in the Dacta region. Initially, it seemed more like a routine mission. There were 16 of us in my squad, all experienced, all confident. Rodriguez, our communication specialist, used to say that we were more likely to be bitten by a snake than hit by the enemy. Little did he know that it would be our last joke together. The approach began at dawn. Lieutenant Martinez, a cautious man respected by all, divided our force into 3 groups. I led the 2nd platoon, with Anderson and Phillips as my main snipers. The dense jungle vegetation made it difficult to see, but years of experience made us realize that something was wrong. The silence was different, too heavy. That's when the first shot cut through the air. A clear shot that hit Phillips in the neck before we could even react. In a matter of seconds, hell materialized. Bursts of AK-47 were coming from every direction. We were in the middle of a meticulously planned ambush. Contact at 3 o'clock, I shouted, throwing myself behind a tree as I returned fire. Anderson managed to establish a firing position, but the enemy had the numerical and positional advantage. There were at least 3 for each of us, entrenched in the elevated positions. Rodriguez's radio crackled with urgent requests for air support, but the low clouds made any immediate support impossible. We were alone, surrounded, and our ammunition was running low. Martinez ordered us to regroup in a defensive formation, but the terrain forced us into a dangerous exposure. The next few hours turned into a deadly dance of advances and retreats. We lost 4 men, trying to reach a more defensible position. The deafening sound of gunfire mixed with cries of pain and shouted orders. The smell of cordite and blood permeated the humid jungle air. Anderson was shot protecting our retreat into a small depression in the terrain. His last words were a request for me to deliver his letters to his wife. Promises made on battlefields carry a different weight. They are sacred, sealed with blood. By nightfall, of the 16 men who had started the mission, only 7 remained in fighting condition. Martinez was wounded, but refused to show weakness. Our ammunition was critically low, and the enemy seemed to be multiplying in the shadows. "We need to hold this position until dawn," Martinez whispered, his face covered in sweat and dried blood. "Reinforcements are on the way, but they need light to locate us." That was the first of many nights of vigil. The enemy used psychological tactics, shouting in broken English, trying to make us reveal our positions. Rodriguez, ever the optimist, tried to keep morale high by telling stories in a low voice about his childhood in Arizona. In the darkness, every noise became a potential threat. Fear was no longer an emotion, but a constant companion, as present as the rifle in my hands. I learned that the true test of a soldier lies not in his ability to fight, but in his ability to maintain his sanity when everything around him collapses. The dawn brought with it a fine, persistent rain, turning our defensive position into a mire. The sound of the drops of water on the leaves of the trees created a macabre symphony, punctuated by occasional gunshots and the moans of the wounded. That first night, I understood that war is not about glory or heroism. It's about survival, about making impossible choices and carrying the weight of them for the rest of your life. Hill 875 was not just a strategic elevation, it was a test of human endurance, a proving ground where the line between life and death became as thin as a razor's edge. And that was just the beginning. The next 3 days would show us the true meaning of hell on Earth, an experience that would forever mark those who survived to tell the tale. The second night on Hill 875 brought with it a change in the enemy's tactics. The Viet Cong had realized that our group was isolated and decided to test our resistance with intermittent waves of attacks. Lieutenant Martinez, though wounded, maintained a determined countenance as we reorganized our defenses. Rodriguez had managed to make brief contact with the command, but the news was not encouraging. The rain and dense fog would prevent any attempt at rescue or air support for at least 24 hours. We were on our own, with scarce supplies and even scarcer morale. "We need to ration the ammunition," I whispered to Martinez. "Every shot has to count." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. Our ammunition count showed less than 40 rounds per man. In normal combat conditions, that wouldn't last even half an hour. It was that night that we got to know a new dimension of psychological terror. The Viet Cong started using loudspeakers, reproducing cries of agony that seemed to come from American prisoners. We knew it was a tactic to destabilize us, but that didn't make it any easier to ignore those distressing sounds. "Hold your position," ordered Martinez, his voice hoarse but firm. "They want us to move, to reveal our location." Young Miller, our field medic, moved silently among the wounded. His medical supplies were running low, and the expression on his face denounced the seriousness of the situation. 2 of our men were showing signs of infection, and we were out of antibiotics. Around midnight, the Viet Cong launched their first coordinated attack. They came in waves, using the darkness as cover. Our line of defense, already weakened, was tested to the limit. The sound of AK-47s was mixed with shouts of order in Vietnamese and the precise firing of our M16s. "Grenades! 3 hours!" shouted Davidson, our explosives expert. We threw ourselves to the ground as the explosions momentarily lit up the night, revealing silhouettes moving in the dense vegetation. Rodriguez was hit during this attack. It wasn't a fatal injury, but the impact on his shoulder left him unable to operate the radio effectively. Losing our main means of communication was a huge blow to our chances of survival. The hours dragged on like decades. Between attacks, the silence was broken only by the muffled groans of the wounded and the distant sound of gunfire in the forest. Each man was fighting not only the visible enemy, but the fear and exhaustion that threatened to consume us. Martinez decided that we needed to change our position. Staying static made us easy targets, and our location was already compromised. With meticulous care, we began a tactical retreat to a higher point on the hill. It was during this move that we lost Davidson. A hidden sniper shot him while he was covering our retreat. His death was quick, but the loss of yet another comrade weighed on our hearts like lead. The new position offered better visibility of the valley below, but exposed us more to enemy fire. Martinez, in his expertise, ordered us to dig shallow trenches using our helmets and any tools available. The soggy ground made the work difficult, but the need to survive drove us on. "Keep your eyes open," I instructed my men. "They'll come again before dawn." The prediction proved correct. At around 4 in the morning, the Viet Cong launched their most intense attack yet. This time, they used mortars to suppress our positions as their troops advanced. "Save your ammunition," shouted Martinez. "Only fire when you're sure of the target." The fighting that followed was brutal. Every man in our unit fought with the ferocity of desperation. Miller, our medic, proved to be an accurate marksman, taking out 3 enemies who were dangerously close to our position. As the sun began to rise, revealing the bodies strewn across the hillside, we counted our losses. Of the 7 combatants who had started the night, there were only 5 left in fighting condition. Our ammunition was critically low and our medical supplies practically exhausted. Martinez gathered the survivors together. His face was marked by exhaustion and determination. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low but firm, "we survived the second night, but the real test is yet to come. We need to prepare ourselves for what will come with the day." Looking at the exhausted faces of my companions, I realized that each of us had aged years in those few hours. War has this ability to compress a lifetime of experiences into moments of sheer terror and determination. The morning brought with it not only light, but the cruel certainty that our ordeal on Hill 875 was far from over. The third day was approaching, and with it, new challenges that would test the limits of our physical and mental endurance. The third day on Hill 875 began with a disturbing silence. The constant rain had turned our trenches into small lakes of mud, and the cold penetrated our bones. Martinez, with his wound now clearly infected, remained conscious through sheer force of will. "Tanner," he called out to me in a low voice. "I need you to take over if I interrupted him before he could finish a sentence. In situations like that, admitting the possibility of defeat was the first step towards the disintegration of the group. Our situation was critical. Miller, our doctor, had improvised bandages using pieces of uniform, but the lack of appropriate medication made every wound, no matter how small, a potential death sentence. Rodriguez could barely move his right arm, but insisted on keeping watch. Around midday, we spotted movement in the enemy positions. Through my fogged-up binoculars, I could count at least 30 Viet Cong fighters strategically positioning themselves. They seemed to be preparing for something big. "They're going to try to exhaust us," I whispered to Martinez. "They know we're weak and low on ammunition." He nodded, his feverish eyes fixed on the horizon. Our ammunition count was alarming. Less than 20 rounds per man. Miller had developed a system of silent signals to coordinate our fire, saving each projectile as if it were the last. In war, adaptation is survival. The first attack of the day came from mortars. The shells fell with frightening precision, forcing us to squeeze even tighter into our muddy trenches. The deafening noise of the explosions was mixed with shouts of order in Vietnamese. "Hold your position," I shouted when I saw two of our men almost give into panic. "They want us to move." It was then that we witnessed something that would change the course of our resistance. Martinez, even in his weakened state, noticed a pattern in the enemy attacks. They were using a classic siege formation, but they were leaving a gap on their left flank. "It's a trap," he muttered, "but also our only chance." We devised a desperate plan. We would use our last smoke grenade to create a curtain of cover. Rodriguez, even though wounded, offered to lead a distraction maneuver, while Miller and I would try to flank the enemy position. The plan was suicidal, but the alternative was to wait for certain death when our ammunition ran out. War has these ironies. Sometimes the only way to survive is to risk everything. At 3 p.m., we began our operation. The smoke grenade created the necessary cover, and Rodriguez began to make enough noise for 3 men. Miller and I crept through the dense vegetation, each movement calculated to avoid detection. What we found in the enemy position surprised us. They too were exhausted, operating on limited supplies. Our daring maneuver caught them off guard, allowing us to take out 3 snipers before they could react. But victory came at a price. Miller was shot in the abdomen during our retreat. I carried him back to our lines, his blood mixing with the mud on my hands. His last words were about his sister in Kansas City. The attack, although costly, had provided us with something vital: ammunition and supplies captured from the enemy. Rodriguez, who had served with South Vietnamese advisors, knew enough about AK-47s to quickly train us in their use. Martinez was getting worse by the hour. The infection in his wound had spread, and he alternated between moments of lucidity and delirium. In his conscious moments, he continued to guide us with the experience of a veteran. "Stick together," he repeated. "Unity is our only strength." As the day drew to a close, a grim realization dawned on us. Of the 16 men who started this mission, only 4 remained in fighting condition. Each carried not only his own burden, but also the weight of the memories of those we had lost. Night was approaching, bringing with it the promise of more horror. The distant sound of helicopters had given us momentary hope, but the darkness and the weather still prevented any rescue attempt. "We need to survive one more night," I told my men. "Just one more night." But as we adjusted our positions and checked our captured ammunition, we all knew that the real battle was just beginning. The 4th day was approaching, and with it, challenges that would test the very limits of our humanity. The 4th day on Hill 875 began with a devastating discovery. Martinez had not survived the night. He left silently during his watch, without a single groan. I found him still sitting in his position, rifle firmly resting, as if he was still standing guard over us. That's how he'd like to be remembered, doing his duty until his last breath. "We need to move on," I said to Rodriguez and the other two survivors, Harrison and Cooper. There was no time for a proper burial. We covered Martinez's body with his own poncho and marked the position with his dog tags. War is so cruel that it turns even mourning into a luxury we can't afford. Our situation was even more precarious. The captured ammunition from the AK-47s gave us some room to maneuver, but we were only 4 men trying to defend a position that would normally require an entire platoon. Rodriguez could barely raise his arm to shoot, and Harrison was showing signs of fever. Around midday, the enemy changed their tactics. Instead of frontal attacks, they began a series of small assaults, testing different points of our defense. It was a clever strategy that forced us to remain constantly alert, draining our already scarce energy. They're wearing us down, observed Cooper, a veteran of 3 tours in Vietnam. They want us to make a mistake. Hunger and thirst were beginning to take their toll. Our last combat ration had been shared the night before, and the water in the canteens was running out. The rain, our only source of hydration, had dwindled to an intermittent drizzle. It was at this point that I made a risky decision. I noticed that a small stream ran about 50 meters below our position. During our observations, we noticed that the Viet Som also used it for refueling, following a temporal pattern in their movements. "I'm going to get some water," I announced. "Cooper, you take temporary command." Rodriguez tried to protest, but his condition wouldn't allow him to carry out the mission. Harrison was too feverish to be trusted. Cooper nodded gravely, understanding the need and the risk. The descent was an exercise in pure concentration. Every step had to be calculated, every movement silent as a shadow. I used all the infiltration techniques I'd learned in Green Beret training. The fear was constant, but there was something beyond it, a mental clarity that only comes when you are completely focused on survival. I reached the stream and began to fill the canteens. The sound of running water almost masked the slight crack of a branch being stepped on. Almost. Years of training had made me react instinctively, throwing myself behind a rock as a Viet Som soldier emerged from the vegetation. Our eyes met for a split second. He was young, perhaps younger than me. At that moment, I saw in him the same tiredness, the same fear that consumed us. War has these ironies. Sometimes you recognize your own humanity in the enemy's gaze. I had no choice, him or me. The hand-to-hand combat was quick and silent. When it was over, I dragged his body into the dense vegetation and filled the canteens. The water tasted metallic, or maybe it was just my imagination. The return to our position was even more tense. Every meter seemed like an eternity, the weight of the canteens making my movements slower and more deliberate. When I finally reached our lines, Cooper informed me that we had lost Harrison. The fever had driven him into a delirium, and he had exposed himself to enemy fire. He started screaming for his mother, Cooper explained, his voice choked. We couldn't stop him in time. Now, there were only 3 of us. The water brought momentary relief, but we all knew that our situation was practically untenable. Rodriguez's radio occasionally picked up snippets of communication, suggesting that rescue operations were underway, but time was running out. In the afternoon, we observed an increase in enemy movement. They were receiving reinforcements, preparing for what looked like a final assault on our position. Cooper, with his experience, estimated at least 50 fighters concentrating on the slopes below. "If we're going to die," said Rodriguez, adjusting his firing position with his good arm, "let's do it our way." We reorganized our defense one last time. Every man knew his firing zone. Every cartridge was counted. Every second of rest was precious. Night was approaching, and with it the promise of yet another test of our endurance. The distant sound of artillery gave us a spark of hope. Perhaps rescue was closer than we thought, but until then, we would have to survive with what we had. 3 exhausted men, limited ammunition, and the iron determination not to give up a single centimeter of Hill 875. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky blood red, an appropriate color for what was to come. The real battle for our survival was just beginning. The dawn of the 5th day found us in a state of feverish wakefulness. Rodriguez, Cooper and I remained alert only by force of habit and generous doses of adrenaline. Our minds, exhausted by the constant stress, began to play tricks. Shadows moved where there was no movement, and imaginary whispers echoed in our ears. "Keep your eyes open, Mark," I muttered to myself, struggling against the weight of my eyelids. The coffee from the last feed sachet had run out hours ago, and fatigue seeped into every fiber of my being. It was Cooper who first noticed the change. The Viet Cong had changed their movement pattern during the night. Instead of the usual test raids, they seemed to be concentrating on specific points around our position. "They're going to try something big," whispered Cooper, his face smeared with mud and dried blood. "They're preparing for a decisive attack." Rodriguez, even with his wounded arm, managed to tune the radio to a frequency that picked up fragments of military communication. Amid the static and interference, we managed to make out words that filled us simultaneously with hope and apprehension. A rescue operation was underway. "We need to hold out for a few more hours," I told my companions. "Support is coming." But the enemy also seemed to have intercepted these communications. At around 5 in the morning, they began a mortar bombardment that made the hill itself tremble. The accuracy of the shots was terrifying. They had clearly mapped our positions over the previous days. "Change position," I shouted when a shell exploded too close, showering our trench with dirt and shrapnel. Cooper was hit in the process. Not a fatal wound, but enough to further limit our already precarious defense capabilities. Dawn brought with it the distant sound of helicopters, but it also revealed the true extent of the enemy siege. There were dozens of them, moving methodically up the hill. Our ammunition was critically low, maybe 20 rounds per man, no more than that. "If we're going to die here," said Rodriguez, adjusting his position with difficulty, "let's make every shot count." It was then that we witnessed something extraordinary. Cooper, even though he was wounded, began to softly sing an old military song. Rodriguez joined in, and soon I was singing too. It was an act of defiance, perhaps even madness, but at that moment it represented all we had left of our humanity in the face of death. The first enemy assault came in waves. We used every inch of cover, every shred of tactical knowledge we possessed. Rodriguez, even with a practically useless arm, proved lethal with his aim. Cooper, bleeding but determined, held our left flank. The sound of helicopters approached, but time seemed to drag on. Every second was an eternity filled with gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. Our world had been reduced to a smaller and smaller circle of contested land. "Ammunition," warned Cooper, his voice hoarse. We were down to our last cartridges. The enemy, realizing our situation, stepped up their attacks. It was at this moment that the first Huey appeared over the horizon, its distinctive sound cutting through the cacophony of battle. Soon others joined him, bringing with them the promise of salvation. But we still had to survive the next few minutes. The Viet Cong, desperate to eliminate us before rescue arrived, threw everything they had at us. Rodriguez was hit again, this time in the chest. His last words were a prayer in Spanish. Air support arrived like a storm of steel and fire, forcing the enemy to retreat. When the first rescue party reached our position, they found only 2 survivors, Cooper and I, still in our fighting positions, almost out of ammunition but alive. "You're stubborn sons of bitches," said the rescue team sergeant, as he helped us evacuate. I took one last look at the position we had defended for 5 hellish days. So many good men had given their lives for that piece of land. As the helicopter took us away, I thought of Martinez, of Rodriguez, of all the others who wouldn't be coming home. Hill 875 had taken its toll in blood and souls, but it had also taught us something about the limits of human endurance and the true meaning of brotherhood. The war would continue, but those 4 days on the hill would remain forever etched in my memory as a testament to the courage, determination, and sacrifice of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. 50 years have passed since those days on Hill 875, but the memories remain as vivid as the scars on my body. After the helicopter rescued us, Cooper and I were taken to a field hospital in Placo. The doctors called our survival a miracle: severe dehydration, infections, extreme exhaustion. But the physical injuries were only the surface of what we would carry forever. During the weeks of recovery, I tried to keep my promises to those who didn't come back. I wrote to Anderson's wife, sending her last letters along with a few words about her bravery. I contacted Miller's sister in Kansas City, telling her how her brother had saved our lives several times. Martinez's family received not only his medals, but also the account of how he led until his last breath. Cooper didn't survive his first week in hospital. The infection that started in his wounds spread quickly, and not even modern antibiotics could save him. In his final moments, he was still humming that same military song that held us together during the last attack. The official reports of the Battle of Hill 875 list cold numbers, casualties, ammunition expended, strategic coordinates. But how can we explain the weight of each life lost? How to put into words the look on Rodriguez's face as he recited his last prayer, or Martinez's quiet determination as he fought off a fever? I received a silver star for my actions in those days, a decoration I keep not as a symbol of heroism, but as a reminder of the true heroes we left behind on that hill. The true value of that battle cannot be measured in medals or military reports, but in the lessons we learned about human nature in its rawest and noblest forms. In the years that followed, I sought out the relatives of every man who served with me on Hill 875. Some encounters were difficult. Fathers who still hadn't gotten over their loss, wives who raised children alone, brothers who held grudges against the war that took so much from them. But each conversation helped to keep the memory of those extraordinary men alive. War marks us in ways that are not always visible. For years, the sound of helicopters instantly transported me back to those final moments on the hill. The smell of wet earth brought back flashbacks of the muddy trenches. Each thunderclap sounded like distant mortars. I took part in veterans groups, trying to find some meaning in everything we had lived through. I met other men who carried their own ghosts, their own hills to climb. I learned that survival doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. It's a daily struggle against memories, against survivors' guilt, against the weight of carrying the stories of those who left. In 1985, I returned to Vietnam. Hill 875 looked different. The vegetation had reclaimed what the war had tried to destroy. I found oxidized cartridges and fragments of military equipment half buried in the soil. I left the nameplates I had kept all these years, a small tribute to the men who had turned that piece of land into an unofficial memorial. During my visit, I met a former Viet Cong soldier who fought against us in those days. We didn't exchange words of hatred or resentment, just the understanding silence of men who had experienced the same horrors on opposite sides of a senseless war. He showed me where they buried their dead, and together we paid our respects to all those who fell. Time softened some wounds, but others remain as vivid as on the first day. Every year, on the anniversary of that battle, I get together with the families of the men from Hill 875. We share stories, yellowed photographs, and keep alive the memory of those who gave everything for the mission and their comrades. The real lesson of Hill 875 is not in military tactics or strategic decisions. It lies in the strength of the human spirit, in the depth of the bonds forged under fire, in the ability of ordinary men to perform extraordinary acts when united by a purpose greater than themselves. Today, at 73, I still dream of those 4 days. I see the faces of my comrades. I hear their voices. I feel the weight of their untold stories. Every time I share this story, it's not just my voice that speaks. It's the collective echo of 16 men who climbed a hill and became brothers. War can bring out the worst in humanity, but it also reveals our capacity for courage, sacrifice, and brotherly love. Hill 875 taught me that survival means more than just continuing to breathe. It means honoring those who were unable to return home. It means telling their stories. It means keeping the flame of their memory alive. And so I continue to tell our story, not as an account of military glory, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the incalculable price of peace. Because as long as there is someone to remember, the heroes of Hill 875 will never really die.